Your ancestors were not trying to have as many children as possible. There is a plant on the coinage of an ancient city, not a king, not a god. A plant. The city is Cyrene, on the coast of what is now Libya, and for about 600 years its entire economy ran on a single species of giant fennel called silphium. It appears on their silver, sometimes the whole plant, sometimes just the seed pod, which is heart-shaped and which is one of the leading candidates for why the heart symbol looks the way it does rather than like an actual heart. Silphium was worth its weight in silver. Roman authors wrote about it constantly. Pliny the Elder recorded that by his lifetime it had become so rare that a single stalk was sent to the Emperor Nero as a curiosity. And then it was gone. Harvested to extinction. It would not grow in cultivation, they tried, and it grew in one narrow strip of coastline and nowhere else on earth, and they took all of it. Now, what was it for? The ancient sources are not shy about this. Silphium was a seasoning, yes. It was also, repeatedly and explicitly, a drug for controlling reproduction. Cyrene, a Greek physician writing in the 2nd century, gives dosages. Dioscorides describes it. The demand that drove a plant into extinction was not culinary. Which brings me to the thing I actually want to argue in this video, because I think almost everyone has the picture backwards. We tend to imagine our ancestors as reproducing at maximum capacity. 12 children, 15 children, a birth every year until the woman's body gave out, a kind of biological default, endless childbearing, because they didn't know any better and had no way to stop. That picture is wrong. It is not slightly wrong. It's close to the opposite of what actually happened for most of human history. Your ancestors limited and spaced their children deliberately. They were quite good at it, and the tools they used included one that is still sitting inside your body right now. Let's start with that one, because it's the big one and it's the one people never mention. Go and look at birth intervals in foraging populations. The best studied case is the Arsja-Inkung of the Kalahari, documented in detail in the 1960s and 70s. The average gap between surviving births was around 4 years, not 1 year, 4. Compare that to European populations a few centuries ago, where intervals of 2 years or less were common. The hunter-gatherers, the people with no medicine, no institutions, no technology in the sense we mean it, were spacing their children roughly twice as far apart as settled agricultural societies. That is not an accident, and it is not infertility. It's a mechanism, and it's ancient. Here's how it works. Suckling, the physical act, the nipple stimulation itself, not the milk, sends a signal up to the hypothalamus that suppresses the pulsing release of a hormone called GnRH. Knock down those pulses and you knock down the signals that drive the ovary. Ovulation stops. That's it. That's the whole switch. Frequent nursing suppresses fertility, but the details matter enormously, and this is where the ancestral pattern separates from the modern one. The suppression depends on frequency, not duration. Not, are you breastfeeding, but how often and how recently. A forager mother carries her infant constantly, nurses in short bouts many times an hour, day and night, for years. That's a near continuous signal. The switch stays off. A modern mother, nursing on a schedule, 4 or 5 feeds a day, with the infant sleeping through the night and eating other food by 6 months, is sending an intermittent signal. The switch flickers back on, often within months. Same hardware. Wildly different output. Because the hardware was tuned for a pattern of care that almost nobody lives anymore. And that's why this is genuinely a piece of ancient equipment rather than a lifestyle fact. This system was not designed to be birth control. It was designed to solve an energetic problem, A human infant is metabolically ruinous. A nursing mother is burning enormous surplus calories, and starting a second pregnancy on top of that is a bad bet for both children, so selection favored a body that simply refused to start one while the first was still fully dependent. The contraception is a side effect of a budgeting rule, and there's a natural test of that claim because something did change the input on a massive scale about 10,000 years ago. Farming. Here's the mechanism, and it's not the one people usually reach for. Agriculture didn't raise birth rates mainly by making people healthier. Early farmers were, by most skeletal measures, in worse shape than the foragers they replaced. Shorter, more dental disease, more signs of nutritional stress. What agriculture produced was soft, storable, calorie-dense mush, cereal gruel, porridge, food an infant with no teeth can eat. Give a mother that, and the nursing pattern collapses. The child can be supplemented at 6 months instead of 2 years. The feeds get less frequent. The signal to the hypothalamus goes intermittent. The switch comes back on, and birth intervals drop from around 4 years to around 2. Half the interval, and you roughly double the number of children a woman produces across her fertile life. That is the engine of the Neolithic population explosion, not better survival, which in many places got worse, but a shorter gap between births. More children born, more of them dying, and the population climbing anyway because the input side scaled faster than the losses. So the mechanism is not theoretical. We can watch it break at continental scale and watch what happens to the numbers when it does. Now, this alone would be a decent video, but it's only the automatic layer. On top of it, human beings added deliberate technology, and they added it very early. The oldest medical document we have that deals with reproduction is Egyptian, the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, around 1825 BCE, nearly 4,000 years old. Among its recipes are pessaries, preparations inserted before intercourse, including one built around acacia gum. And here's the part that stops it being a curiosity. Acacia gum ferments to lactic acid. Lactic acid is spermicidal. It was, for much of the 20th century, the active ingredient in commercial contraceptive jellies. They did not know why it worked. There was no theory of sperm, no germ theory, no chemistry. But the empirical result was real, and it was written down, and it was still being used 4,000 years later under a different name. The list goes on, and it is longer than you'd think. Barrier methods appear across a wide range of cultures, physical blocks made from whatever was locally available and roughly the right shape. Queen Anne's lace, wild carrot, whose seeds have documented anti-implantation effects in animal studies and which shows up in folk practice across Europe and Asia. Pomegranate. A whole shelf of preparations described in Greek and Roman medical texts with a precision that makes clear this was a practiced craft, not superstition. Some of it did nothing. A lot of it was theatre. But the hit rate is meaningfully above chance, and it clusters. The same plants recur in unconnected traditions, which is what you'd expect if people were noticing actual effects rather than inventing them. And there's a third layer that gets missed entirely, which is that culture was doing the same job from a different direction. Postpartum sex taboos are one of the most widespread customs in the ethnographic record. A rule that a couple abstains for a period after a birth, sometimes months, sometimes years, often explicitly until the child is walking or weaned. Different societies give completely different reasons for it. The milk will be spoiled, the child will sicken. It's simply not done. The stated reasons vary wildly. The effect does not. Every one of those rules lengthens the gap between births, and every one of them sits on top of a biological mechanism that's doing the same thing. That's what a working system looks like when nobody has designed it. The hormone does the first stretch automatically. The custom covers the tail end when nursing is tapering and the switch is coming back on. Neither layer knows about the other. Together, they produce the 4-year interval. You don't need anyone to understand ovulation for that to function. You just need a rule that outlived the people who made it. I do need to put a hard flag on this, and I want it in the middle of the video rather than buried at the end. This pharmacopoeia was dangerous, not mildly. Pennyroyal, one of the most widespread traditional preparations in Europe and North America, contains a compound called poulegone that destroys liver tissue. The dose that has an effect on a pregnancy and the dose that kills the woman are close enough together that it has gone on killing people into the modern era. There are documented deaths from it in living memory. The historical record we have is heavily weighted toward the things that worked. The failures are quieter, so none of this is a recommendation, and nothing here should be read as one. This is a story about what people knew, not a manual. But it does dismantle the myth, and I want to be precise about which myth. The myth is not that pre-modern life had a lot of children in it. It did. Child mortality was catastrophic, and having several children was the only way to have any adults. The myth is that this was passive, that people were simply carried along by their biology, reproducing at maximum rate because the concept of doing otherwise hadn't occurred to them. It had occurred to them. There are recipes, there are dosages, there is a plant that went extinct because the demand for it never let up for 6 centuries. Which raises the question of what happened to all of it, and the answer is one of the stranger episodes in the history of knowledge. It was suppressed and then it was forgotten, and the forgetting was surprisingly complete. Across the early modern period, this material moved from the medical literature into the category of the illicit, and then out of the written record entirely. The historian John Riddle traced this in detail. Recipes that appear in classical and medieval texts with confidence and specificity get vaguer in later copies, then disappear. By the 19th century, European and American physicians were describing reproductive control as a modern problem requiring modern solutions, writing as though the question were new. It wasn't new. It was 4,000 years old, and the answers had been written down repeatedly. They had simply stopped being copied. This is worth sitting with because we have a strong intuition that knowledge accumulates, that we know strictly more than the people before us, and in most domains that's roughly true. But knowledge that lives in an oral tradition, held mostly by women, mostly outside institutions, and attached to something a society decides it disapproves of, that knowledge is fragile in a way that knowledge written into a university curriculum is not. It doesn't get refuted. It just stops being passed on, and one generation later it's gone, and the generation after that is confident it never existed. So here's where this leaves us. You are running a piece of hardware that spaces your children, tuned for a pattern of infant care that almost no one in an industrial society practices, which is why it appears not to work anymore. It works fine. The input changed, and layered on top of it, your ancestors built a real technology. Inconsistent, sometimes lethal, but genuinely effective in places, and old enough to predate writing in most of the world. They were not maximizing. Nothing that has to feed its children maximizes. Every organism that invests heavily in its offspring faces the same trade-off between how many and how well, and humans invest more heavily than nearly anything alive. 4 years between children in a foraging band was not a failure to reproduce faster. It was the correct answer.